Come on, we can do better. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right. Welcome to the Lewis Perry Jr. Chapel on an important day of focus, reflecting, and doing, both for our community, our nation, and our world. Today, we will honor both the life and the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King gave the ultimate sacrifice, his life, for a cause for which we continue to fight today, the civil rights movement and equality for African Americans. While progress has been made, there remains much work to do, and that is the responsibility of not only every single person in this community, but also in our world. We'll take a step back today from the conveyance and digestion of content of a normal class day and move into discussing, reflecting, and doing in our workshops. And we will do so from a place that is central to our community and, I believe, to our world. And that is a place of belonging, of understanding that each and every one of you and your experience in this community matters. It's the very fabric of who we are and makes us the rich and nurturing place that we can be and has good things to accomplish in this complex world of ours. And yet, we are not perfect. We all have our shortcomings. It is our growth mindset and our commitment to learning and improvement that is the difference between continued ignorance and healthy growth. By leading with questions such as help me understand and tell me more, we are better able to understand others and their experiences so that we ourselves may also be understood. Before turning things over to our speakers, I'll finish with a quotation that Mrs. Cowper shared last year from an essay that Dr. King wrote during his senior year at Morehouse College. His premise was something in which I believe to the core, which is that education has both a utilitarian and, more importantly, a moral function. It is theory versus application, content versus action. Both are necessary and critical for the success of our society, and we are all here to continue to develop and practice both, and understand truly what making the hard right decision means. Dr. King states, "The function of education, therefore, is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. But education which stops with efficiency may prove the greatest menace to society. The most dangerous criminal may be the man gifted with reason, but with no morals." A reminder that there is no greater purpose in life than being a person of character and integrity, of sound moral and ethical grounding. I'm honored and proud that members of our own community will share their own stories and perspectives on the significance of this day, on belonging, and their own journeys. A big thank you to Senora Torres, Mr. Reynolds, Mrs. Lynn, Mr. Ray, and Mr. Williams for your courageousness in so doing. Please know how greatly appreciated and deeply respected it is, and each of you are. Senora, please begin.
Can you see me? You see? Accommodations? Now we're talking about. Gracias. Sense of belonging, to belong or not to belong, that's the title of my speech. Good morning, everyone. Buenos días a todos, a todas y a todes. It feels so good to be back on campus after what I felt like such a long quarantine. I am so excited to be able to reconnect with the Fountain Valley community and share some thoughts of developing a sense of belonging. My name is Eunice Torres Vélez, and I am from Puerto Rico, a Caribbean island located between the Dominican Republic and U.S. Virgin Islands. I was born in Maya West, Puerto Rico, the island's 8th largest municipality, located on the west coast. Puerto Ricans are often simplified into a formula composed of Spanish, African, and the island indigenous people Taino Heritage. This exercise of acculturation led to the creation of a unique island culture that shared many similarities with its ancestors' cultures while proudly standing at its own entity. My own family, like many other Puerto Rican families, represent this heritage. My maternal family was mostly composed of Spanish descendants, while my dad's was mostly composed of Afro-Latinos. My parental great-grandmother was an enslaved person, and my grandmother was a maid for a very famous judge in the island. I have 2 brothers. Many people don't know that. I have 2 brothers, and both are educators. My brother is a teacher in Texas. He's a Spanish teacher in Texas, and my older brother is a college professor in Puerto Rico. And like the Puerto Rican people, we all look different, but we know that it's part of who we are and where we belong. In other words, I am a Puerto Rican person, embodying all aspects, positive and negative, of the historical, cultural, biological, and socio-political circumstances that happen in order for me to stand before you today. As a young child, my parents moved to the mountains near Maya West in a town called Añasco. However, a large portion of my life still remained in my hometown. Family, friends, school, and eventually university were all in Maya West. This led to the sense of never truly belonging to Añasco because I only went there to sleep in my room. Even to this day, when I ask what town I am from, I will say Maya West because this experience taught me a very important yet cliche lesson. Home is where the heart is. And everything I love was in that town, affectionately known as El Pueblo del Mango, or the town of the mango. Growing up so close to my birthplace and on an island made it very easy to find places and communities that provide a sense of belonging. Unfortunately, unbeknownst to me, living on an island place surrounded by water where you don't have an option to drive and experience another country narrowed by my worldview and further intensify my attachment to my family, friends, and colleagues. Little did I know that my horizons would one day expand beyond my imagination. As of 2020 census, there are over 65.3 million Hispanics and Latinos living in the United States of America. However, even as a Puerto Rican with the luck to have a U.S. citizenship by default, I can testify to the casual racism of jokes about my skin, my tan. Sometimes people ask me here what I got my tan. And access to the political, economic, and social inequalities that exist from people in color in our community. Like the great Martin Luther King Jr. said, and so even though we face the difficulties to today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is the acknowledgement that while this country has committed terrible acts, we continue to strive for a future that works towards correcting past injustices and reaching our dream of being an inclusive society. The previous statement sum up my reluctance to leave my home. However, just like Martin Luther King, I was still dreaming of a future that not only provided me with better personal circumstances, but one that allowed me to share my expertise in a way that strengthened the dreams of others, in this case, my students. Fast forward to 2021. I can only imagine that many of you here today can relate it to the process of arriving in a new country, town, and school all at once. No longer was I comfortably sheltered within the 100 miles of my island. I found myself in a community that was very different from my own, not only in its geographical features, but also demographics. During this process, we cling to the familiar. For example, as a Latina, I sought out individuals based on cultural similarities and affinities. That's why here in campus I didn't have any problem with belonging with the Latinos. Like Martin Luther King King Color of Love for reggaeton music. Like Martin Luther King dream of having black and white children holding hands as a family, this was my experience with the Asian community here at Fountain Valley. By simply telling me, Teacher Torres, come and sit with us in the dining hall. Thank you to Fountain Valley School community for the love, respect, and acceptance. Thank you. Gracias. Muchas gracias. Love you too.
Thank you, Senor. Mr. Reynolds.
We humans like to belong, whether it be to a family, a volleyball team, an orchestra, or a school. It can give us a sense of wholeness, of identity, of purpose. As a white, privileged male, I have often felt comfortable and welcome in social settings and groups. I have often felt such a sense of belonging, but this has not always been so. I used to love soccer. I started playing when I was in 5th grade, and my high school team won multiple state championships. The school was adjacent to the University of Connecticut, and their soccer team were national champions. I attended a large public high school, and we did not have football, so many athletes competed on the soccer team, and it was serious. Our coach would send us on 2, 3, and even 5-mile runs before practice. So when I got to 9th grade, I tried out for the team. I played JV that spring. I played tennis during the fall. I played JV again during my sophomore year. I made the varsity team my junior year. I was excited and also scared. Many of the boys on the team were not my friends, and they were known to be mean. I listened to the Beatles, they listened to AC/DC. I wore sneakers, they wore heavy boots. They smoked cigarettes. They would stand in a flank along the school's hallway and tease people who walked by. And I learned that they liked to haze newcomers to the soccer team. And so during one of our long runs before practice, they ganged up on me, they pushed me to the ground, ripped off my shorts, and ran away. I somehow fashioned something to wear and finished the last 2 miles by myself. On another day, when I got to the locker room, my lock was covered in a roll of athletic tape. To make matters worse, the coach did nothing. He said nothing to me. He said nothing to them. Somewhere in the back of my mind, the pain still exists. That rejection, alienation, still makes me feel vulnerable and unwanted. I did not belong. Here I am some 40 years later, and the pain is still there. Hazing is supposed to welcome you to the club, a sort of initiation. I did not feel welcome. I finished the season and vowed never to play soccer again. The following spring, I tried out for the cross-country running team. I found camaraderie. I made friends. We laughed. I also got a horrible case of shin splints and ran only one race. But I was part of the team. I belonged. Luckily, those mean boys and their hazing did not dampen my love of soccer. In college, I played intramural soccer. I coached soccer at my previous school. And a few years ago, I played on an indoor soccer team with fellow FVS teachers. I love the beautiful game. But I have no love for those boys. I have no love for hazing, initiations, or fraternities. In fact, I chose to attend Bates College partly because they did not allow fraternities or sororities. I think that one of the ideas of hazing is that once it is done to you, you do it to others. Had I played my senior year, the theory goes, I would have gotten to haze younger athletes. No, thank you. I wanted to stop the cycle, and I did. As an adult, I have tried to be inclusive, to include others. I try to be open and accepting and of differing opinions and ideas. I avoid sarcasm, which in a way is a type of verbal bullying. And I urge you to surround yourself with those who support you, who make you feel good and whole. In the play Hamlet, a father advises his son when he finds good friends to grapple them unto thy heart with hoops of steel. Keep your friends close, treasure them. I've seen many friendships made at FVS that continue well into adulthood. And keep your eyes out for those people who are down, those people who are somehow ostracized or excluded from a group. Include them. Help to make them feel that they belong. It may change their life. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Mrs. Lynn?
Okay. So my story begins with a family. My story begins, can be summed up with the two Martin Luther King quotes. So my first one, which really sums up my greater extended family and my ancestors, is if you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. And that really, truly embodies my ancestors who have been here since, before the country began, actually. So my ancestors I have family members who were previous slaves. I also have family members that were previous servants. And as I will get to later, don't always picture Black Americans as only people who came from the ship. Not all of our relatives were on slave ships. So I have some who were here before the complete formation of the United States, and they were in the Midwest, and they traveled and were servants of Meriwether Clark, actually, even. So my family represents the idea of always moving forward. I do have a very typical Black American experience where my family was constantly pursuing the American dream, and it was constantly overcoming obstacles. We refused to accept the narrative that because of the color of our skin, that we couldn't pursue the American dream. And then we held very close and dear to our heart the words of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. We pursued education throughout when we were servants, when we were slaves, and when we were free. If you look at the narratives of the people in my family, you will see, little clips about how we were good at sums, and and education was an important thing. One of my ancestors actually went to Tuskegee Institute when it first opened. So we were definitely ones who wanted to make sure that we were literate, much like most of the Blacks in those days. I don't know if many of you know this, but the literacy among the slaves was very great. There's like 75% could read. It's one of those things that was against the law, and we always pursued, whatever. We believed very strongly that we could do whatever, and we can't give whatever, and we could pursue the American dream, and so that we did. My family has also migrated to the north to look for opportunities, and we basically were people of perseverance. So fast forward to my mother. I'm just going to skip a whole lot of generations and just briefly talk about my mother's perseverance. My mother suffered from mental illness her whole life. She was bipolar and clinically paranoid, and because of that, many of the choices that she made, and because of her actually independence and strong independence and refusal to get help from anyone else, because of that, that meant that we often lived in poverty, and sometimes we're basically homeless. So many times of my life, we have stayed with family members, with friends. We've lived in shelters. We lived in hotels, motels, wherever we could stay. Sometimes we just rode public transportation just so that we could stay warm. But throughout all of that, my mother always held on to the dream that we did not have to live and accept the narrative. And even with no car, if it meant we had to walk for hours, we did, to purchase books that were above our grade level, because my mother strongly believed in education. And even if we weren't in school, my mother's school, we went to my work with my mother, and we participated and did her work, which was always worse than regular school. I loved school because it was so much better than my mom's classes. And she always instilled in us that we could do better and that we will do better, and we should. And we did. And she instilled that in the rest of her siblings and also in her cousins as well. So even though many had humble beginnings, we did all achieve the American dream, and we did all succeed. Now you may say, oh wow, what a crazy life. I will tell you that those struggles that we had were not my greatest struggles. I do not look back on being homeless with sorrow. I don't even wish to change anything. None of those times were sad times for me. We had each other, we were family, and we loved one another, and and it didn't feel like it was bad. We didn't feel poor. We didn't feel like we were longing. I will tell you that the greatest struggle would be from not always feeling like we belonged, and also meeting people who didn't also recognize that we shouldn't meet the narrative of that we are not the same and we are not that different and that we can achieve. That I would say that my greatest struggles were being around other people who did not know Black people and did not have much experience, and therefore had lower expectations of us. So had teachers that didn't necessarily recognize the giftedness and did not recognize that we should take honors classes, and or college counselors who did not share about college visits or what classes you should take. So those would be the kinds of struggles that I would say those were the sort of pain points, a lot like what Mr. Reynolds was saying and experiencing. And I also would say that struggle continued on through adulthood, meeting different cultures, while meeting my husband, whose family is from Taiwan. They had very little understanding of Black people, so I did not feel like I belonged in that family. And unfortunately, they disowned him for a while. And then having children who also have spouses whose families did not accept or felt like that we belong. Also not feeling like we belong because of the religion that I share. Because I am a Christian, and often feel like I do not belong. A lot of people don't understand who Christians are. The same with being conservatives. Definitely don't feel like I belong because my family has been conservative for many years, and people don't understand that. There's always been this single narrative. How many of you guys have seen that story, the problem with a single narrative? Or I know I'm not quoting that title correctly. I have always had that struggle where people make assumptions about who I am as a Black person, or rather who I'm not, because when they do meet me and they hear what I say, like, oh, you're very much like a Chinese person. No, I'm a Black person. Oh, you're very much like a Hawaiian. You act like a Hawaiian, or you act like a white person. No, I act like a Black person. So for me, the idea to really help make sure that people feel like they belong is to actually get to know people and to hear and listen, as you've heard Mr. Webb say, to say, help me understand and get to know me. But I would say the most important thing is to put aside your views or your ideas of what you think or who you think people are. Because most of the time they don't fit the box that you expect them to fit in. They don't play the sport that they expect you to play. For me, it was basketball. I didn't want to play basketball, I wanted to play tennis. And the Williams sisters were not around when I was a kid. So for me to play tennis, that was like, no, that's a white sport. No, it's not, it's mine. So there were do not make assumptions of who conservatives are, who liberals are, who whites are, who blacks, all sorts of, whatever, fill in the blank. Make sure that you take the time to get to know them and don't make assumptions. And we all do, myself included. I'm sure some of you have heard the stories of the many things that I've asked my husband and said to him, not good. But, here we are 34 years later, and we're still, the best of friends. And this sort of brings up another quote, because there are many of you who have felt like you didn't belong, much like myself. And sometimes that will create a tad bit of anger or a tad bit of frustration. And my family also lives by this other quote. We must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive. He who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love. And here's another part that is I'm stopping this quote just to make sure that you pay very close attention to this. This is what you should all live by. There is some good in the worst of us, and there is some evil in the best of us. When we discover this, we are less prone to hate our enemies. It is only through forgiveness and love that we can ever hope to get along and help one another feel like we belong.
Thank you, Mrs. Lynn. Mr. Ray?
Thank you. Good morning. So I'm going to tell you how I ended up in the United States, and it all started back in 1997 when I went to a small school in the middle of Alabama, and I mean the dead center of Alabama. And people asked, well, why did you choose that school? And my answer is simple. I felt a belonging because there was other international students there. There was students from England, Scotland, which you would think we wouldn't get on, but we did, and South Africa and Zimbabwe. And then there was obviously a mix of domestic kids as well. So I felt this was the best place for my education. Little did I know that for 4 years we would be known as the foreigners. We were asked questions. Do I know the Queen? Do I have tea with the Queen? The South African and Zimbabwe boys. How'd you get to school? Do you travel on elephant? Do you travel on tigers? And we laughed it off at the time, but until this date, now I kind of look back and think, wow, a lot of naivety and also a missed opportunity to educate. That's, and to this day I'm still friends with all of those students that I went to school with, that were my teammates. And we still laugh it off, but deep down I think for some of them there was a lot of disrespect there. But we moved on. We wanted to work on campus, so we thought, well, it's easy. We'll just, go get a job on campus. We needed to find lifts to Birmingham, Alabama, to immigration to be able to get a social security number. We could only work 4 hours a week at that time. Other kids were earning a lot more money. We got 4 hours a week in which to earn. My parents, although I probably didn't need to work, wanted me to work to understand what it was to earn money. So I didn't get the same experience as other students. None of us foreigners got that experience to do that. When we reached the end of our degree program, we never thought that we would stay in the country. We thought that we would come, we would get our degree, have an opportunity to play, and then we would head home. But I met my wife my senior year, and so I was like, well, you know what? I think I want to stay a little longer. I want to see where maybe this can lead to. So I had to apply. So I had to apply for an optional practical training card. This gives you 1 year to work in an environment that you do your degree in. My degree was in kinesiology, and I wanted to do soccer coaching. I was able to do that. I did it for a year, but there was no opportunity to sponsor at that time. They weren't going to sponsor anybody to stay in the country. So then I thought, well, what can I do here? So then I enrolled in graduate school. Graduate school extended my F1 visa. Graduate school was challenging again because there was very few international students on the campus. And the coach that I went to work for the women's program left. So I was pulled both ways because I was disciplined for not being at practice because I was at class, and then I was disciplined for not being at class because I was at practice. So I was pulled both ways and was told by the dean of students there, if you're not at class, we're going to invoke your F1 visa and you're going home. So I had to think of, well, what can I do now? Fortunately, I felt like I was ready to take that next big step, and that big step being marriage. So I asked my wife, how many times? 4? 4 times. And finally she said, she's sitting at the back there, that's why I said that. Finally she said yes. So we got married on January 24th, 2003. And we said to one another, well, what next? How do I stay in this country legally? So luckily, Tinsley's uncle was a lawyer, and he put us in touch with an immigration lawyer. And at the time, we were living in Montgomery, Alabama. We applied for the permanent resident visa, which is known as the green card. It's not green, it's white. We had to take a trip to Atlanta to get a temporary visa to work so that I could support my family while I was waiting for the green card to happen. During that time, we moved to Houston, Texas, where I got a coaching job, so I had to inform the US immigration that I was moving so they knew exactly where I was. During the period of waiting for my green card, unfortunately my grandmother passed away. I wasn't able to go home for the funeral due to the fact that leaving the country meant that I might not get back into the country. I made the phone call, I asked, and basically, and politely, but you can leave, but you might not get back. So I was torn between paying my respects to my grandmother, but being able to get back into the country to provide and support my family, which at the time was Tinsley and a young Addie. After finally waiting for 2 years, the filing of the green card came through, and the next step was an interview. Both Tinsley and I had to wait in a waiting room in immigration where we knew everything that we were about to say was correct, but you feel like you've done something wrong. Finally, our name was called, Ray, to waiting room 3. We sit in the waiting room and we're looking at one another and we have no idea what to expect. In comes a gentleman with a folder. How are you both doing? Fine, thank you. What colour's Tinsley's toothbrush? How much money does she have in her bank account? What are her parents' names? And then for Tinsley, what is Kevin's hometown in England? Where did Kevin go to senior school or high school? These are questions that we knew the answers to, but you stumble as you're answering because you want to be 100% sure because you think, well, maybe I won't get to stay. After passing the interview, the next step was a medical which you must pass all those medical tests or you're on the plane going home. Finally, everything was done and dusted, and I was a permanent resident of the United States. I've currently been here 19 years, about to be 20, well, have to renew my green card again. I feel very fortunate that I'm able to be here and be in an environment where I have a sense of belonging with people from the South, but now people here in Colorado. I guess my next step is now to be reinserted as a British guy, because when I go home and say, hi, yo, how you doing? I'm a soccer coach. All my friends want to disown me because it's not soccer, it's football. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ray. Mr. Williams.
Morning, all. Morning. I'm going to start my story with a question. That question is, what do FVS and Dr. King have in common? On second thought, let's save that for a second. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. And for the first 13 years of my life, well, for the first 13 years of school, in the Newark school system, from kindergarten to 12th grade, I didn't go to school with any white people at all. And sadly, some schools in Newark are the same, even to this day. So I didn't have the opportunity to enjoy and get to know white people at that time. As a junior in high school was the first time I saw the I Have a Dream speech. That was definitely a changing moment in my life. Because once I saw that speech, I knew that things couldn't be this way. Because I was taught all of my life to fear white people, to mistrust white people. And a part of me did. Fast forward to my freshman year of college, day one of my freshman year in college. My roommate and I, who was a classmate of mine in high school, we were putting our stuff away in our rooms, and there was a knock at the door, a firm knock. So we said to ourselves, who is this? No one knows we're here. We just got here. This is day one. So I opened the door, and before me stood a mountain of a man, 6'4", 275 pounds, a white man with blonde hair and blue eyes. This was the man I was told to fear. This was the man I was told to mistrust. But then he spoke, and he said, "Hi, my name is Scott Poggi. I live across the hall from you, and I'm inviting you over for pizza and soda. The football game is on. Philadelphia Eagles and New York Giants. I'm a Giant fan." So I was automatically interested, but I was still fearful. For those 6.5 hours to 7 hours that we spent with him and with his roommate, I found out that we can't fear white people. And then the I Have a Dream speech came back to me. And the part of the speech that came back to me was, instead of looking at a person for the color of their skin, I have to look for the content of that individual. Scott Poggi today is still one of my best friends. The reason I bring up this story is because I believe that we definitely need to come together. Because whether you know it or not, whether or not you think about it, you're all Dr. King's dream. By sitting in this chapel, by sitting arm in arm, eating in the dining facility, going to class, you're Dr. King's dream. And that cannot be lost. Now, getting back to that question I asked earlier, what do FVS and Dr. King have in common? Values. The values of the school are the same as the value of Dr. King's. Dr. King exemplified courage because he went out there. He knew what the odds were that he would be successful, but he went out and he fought every single day of his life. He lived for it, he taught for it, he died for it. He showed tremendous courage in what he had to do and what he had to say. Compassion. He wanted to understand people, not understand a color, not understand a gender, not understand a sexual orientation. He wanted to understand people. Because in order to understand people, that's what moves the message forward. Curiosity. He was curious about people. He wanted to know what made them tick. Because if you know about a person, then you're less likely to criticize that person or to hate that person. Self-reliance. He knew the odds were not great for him, so he took that burden upon himself because he knew that people would come after him that would pick up that torch and move it forward. And he was right. Open-mindedness. Dr. King knew, and this is a quote that I love and I use quite often, a closed mind is an empty mind. Dr. King understood that open-mindedness was the key to conversation. Because how can I criticize you if I have preconceived notions and judgments of you. All of those, and these values are shared here in sufficient measure. You live them every day when you go into a classroom. When you see someone sitting at lunch by themselves and you ask them their name and you introduce yourself and you sit down and eat with them. When a student has a problem in a class and you help them by somebody who comes from a different country or a different culture than yours. Or understanding of sexual orientation. So please remember when you leave here, when you're having lunch, or in a number of years ahead for the rest of your lives. Remember the words of Dr. King, and remember what the man stood for. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Mrs. Cowper.
Don't worry, I'm not telling my story. I just want to thank everybody who came up and spoke today. That was really amazing, so thank you all. Okay, so we are going to dive into our activities for today. I just wanted to briefly introduce our next one. It's from a research method called Photovoice. So what you are all going to do is get in your advisories. So feel free, if you haven't heard from your advisors, to just get together and meet outside. This can be done entirely